Hey everybody, welcome back. Kevin here. And in this video, we're going to be looking at completing our flight controller in terms of adding and editing data for this flights database table using that flight model and flight controller. Now, the thing that we have to note here are how our requests work again with these controllers. And I really want to instill this in you so you can understand at a deep level how this works. So if you run into issues, you can really see what's going on and be able to debug your own code. And so whenever we send a request through the browser here, we're sending it again to this URL, okay, this flight index. Now flight here represents the name of the controller, flight controller, and then index represents the method that we're going to call on that specific controller. So this flight index is going to be in the code, the flight controller on index. And we're using a naming convention here, okay? So this controller piece maps to the flight keyword. If we were to use a different keyword, then that URL would be different. And that's how we got this index page. And for the add and edit pages, we're going to need to use this similar type of convention. And again, because we use those resources in our index, in our functions.php file, again, because we registered our pages with this special function, it's going to generate all these pages that we need for us in terms of, when I say pages, what I mean are routes, those admin routes. And so this is very particular when it comes to WordPress routes in the admin of WordPress. And if you wanted other routes, then you can do that with TypeRocket, but we're not going to cover that. I'm just letting you know it is possible to add more than these particular methods essentially that are listed here. So the first thing that we need to do is to create that form that's going to represent our database table. So we need form fields for kind of essentially these particular columns, customer ID, seat ID, notes, and meta. So let's go create our form for this. And so what we'll do is form equals tr form. And then we need to let this form know what model is it that we are working with. So flight model, and we'll just say that's this class. And then we're going to reuse this same form for our edit page. And so we're going to have a variable called button here. And then we are going to return a view like we did before. So return a view, and then it's going to be flights dot form. And again, the reason that we're calling this flights.form instead of flights.add is because the edit and add page are going to be exactly the same. So it's just going to make more sense to consolidate that into a single view file. Okay, so we're going to have this form here. And then we need to get this information, these variables and objects, into this particular view. And so we can pass information into a view using a second argument. And we will call this form, and we'll call this button. And this is going to get our information into a view for this form, okay? So I'm going to echo out the button just so we can see it happening here, and we're passing this variable as button as this button key. If I was to call this btn, then this key would be what the variable is named here, okay, btn. Oh, here we go. Let's save this and then go to the page in the admin. And we'll hit add here, and we'll see it says add. So that's our button. And essentially, we could do the same thing for the edit page. However, I'm going to use this tutorial because it has all of this code in here for us. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to copy this information for the edit page and paste it on over. So we'll scroll down to the edit section here. And this edit page will be, similar when we go to the admin. It'll be at that flight_edit page, okay? And we'll see what these create and update methods are in a little while. However, what we'll see here is for the edit form, we're no longer using the static flat class here like we are here. We're just doing essentially the string name of the class of flight. or our model, right? So in this instance, we want the form to populate with information that's already in our database. So if we go to that record here for this flights, if we go to record 1, we want to pull in all the information that's already in our database and get it into that form. So that's why we have this flight here. Now, we'll get into sort of how this works, like how it knows which flight to pull. Is it going to pull flight ID of 1, or if there's 20 records, is it going to pull flight ID of 20? Like, how does TypeRocket know which record to pull from the database? Like I said, we'll get into that later. And then also this little compact function here. This is just a nice little way to create an array using PHP that's going to use the variable name form. And it's essentially going to make the array, associative array, use the same key as the name of the variable. So the name of the variable will become the key of the array. So it's literally the same thing as doing this. Okay. So like this equals this. However, if we were to do btn, then you can't get compact to do that because you're changing the name of the variable. You're changing the name of the key, and with compact, the name of the key will always be the name of the variable. Okay, so with that in place, we'll also want to do that here. And the reason for this is if you change the name of a variable, you kind of want to know, you want it to throw some sort of error so that you can update your page here to respond to that change. So it's just a good way of like throwing errors in your face early so you can catch bugs before they become a real problem. So we'll jump back here, and then we're just going to copy our form over, and that's going to be for our database table representation. So we'll have that button variable again, and then we're going to have a select field, and we're going to set the name of those particular fields to the names that correspond to the database table names. So again, customer ID and seat ID, and then notes, because the name of the field or its label is the name of the actual field in the database. We don't have to set a name because it will just default to the lowercase version of this. If I was to say notes 2, then it would make the name of this field, once it goes into HTML, the input name part of it would be, what is it? Notes _ 2. So it's going to format it to this kind of style. And it should always kind of be the format that you use with your databases, to use this underscore pattern. And that's the pattern that WordPress uses. So we kind of force it in TypeRocket. You can't use camel case and that sort of thing here with the custom database table style. You would be best to kind of reformat these things. Okay, so we're going to leave it as notes, and then meta will save as meta. And that's kind of how this is set up. And then if we jump over to the form here, we will go back to add and refresh the page. And then, hey, looky there, we have the ability to pick a seat, select a customer. We only have one user, and we could say some notes. Now, if I hit, let's add some name, and we'll say Kevin, okay, just to fill out this repeater field. I'm gonna hit add here, and it's gonna give us nothing, but we did go to this add page again. And if I inspect the page, we'll see that under network, I'm gonna refresh, we'll see that we have hit this URL. It gave us a 200 response, so the page did load. However, it's a post request. And in this post request, we have some post data, okay? So from that custom form, we submitted this post data, the seat ID of 10, the customer ID of 1, those notes with the HTML that we had submitted, that meta field with name and Kevin in it. And so all of our data is here, but we're going to this route. And before, remember how we said that the flight underscore add would take us to that add method? Well, whenever we send a post style request, it's not going to send us to the add method. It's going to send us to the create method on our controller. And so instead of going to add here, we're going to go to create. And the reason for this is that each one of these routes per se, these routes, right, the URL part, responds to different request methods that the browser can send. So if we send a post request through a form which is the standard request method that gets sent whenever you submit a form. It's going to say, hey, for this route, post requests on the controller go to this create method. And then put requests for the edit page, which we'll see later, will go to the update method. And that's how we're going to get our different methods on our controller to fire and do different things based on the type of request method that's being sent. And let's jump back to the code and look at this. So the request method is post. If we scroll down, we'll also see that the form submits this underscore method post. And this is what we would call like a pseudo method, because HTML forms, the form that we just submitted, if I hit back here, the form that we just submitted, an HTML form can only send post requests. However, Ajax can send put and delete requests. And the reason that this is important is because we can use these verbs, create, update, delete, as, or really in HTTP terms, post, put, and delete. We can use those verbs to tell our controller to use different methods, which then can allow us to separate our logic. And so that is why when submitting a form, we want to respond to that post request. So we can then use our controller and that information to direct our request to the correct place. And that allows us to separate our view logic, the logic that builds the UI, from the logic that's going to insert a record into the database. And so I'm going to hit add here again, and we'll look at this request, and it's a 200 post request. It's using this spoofed method. And the reason that I mentioned that HTML forms can only send post requests is because as we see the edit page, this is going to be a spoof request of put. So we'll see put down there, but we'll see post here. And so TypeRocket's going to pay attention to this method whenever we get a form request. All right, so now that we have our data, we need to do something with it. So let's jump back to this create method where we're being sent the request, and I can kind of prove that to you if I do a var dump here, hi. Refresh the page, here we have hi on the page. So what we really want are those request values. Now in TypeRocket, we have access to this TypeRocket HTTP request object. So we can access this through the create method. And whenever we call this method, TypeRocket's automatically going to fill out as many of the type hinted values as we can. Okay, so if we did, let's say hi as a variable, and TypeRocket's not going to know what to put in this value, so you'll have an error. But if we were to do a default value of say null, then we're going to get the request object and hi. And then if we made hi some other value, let's say it's a flight, for example, then it's going to make this variable hi the actual flight object. Okay, so we might actually do that for this case. So we're going to create a new flight whenever we pass this in the request. So let's take this request. And the nice thing about this request in TypeRocket, unlike, let's say, your first impression would probably have been to go for this post variable and to get your data from tr here. And the reason you would use tr is because in here we'll see that all of these values are sent over as an array of information, and that array of information is prefixed with tr. So if we grab the tr from the post field, then it'll give us an array of all of this. And that's why you would do this, post superglobal. However, the request method can let us bypass needing to grab that tr prefix, and it's a nice clean way to grab all of our fields. So I'll refresh the page here, and we'll see here's all of our data. Now that we have the data, we could pass that data to this flight object, and we can simply save a new record using these fields. So I can just pass those fields directly into the flight. Hit save here on the file, refresh the page, and then we'll see that, hey, we didn't format this properly. It's telling us that our flights meta is not formatted for JSON. And this reveals to us an issue with our current model. Okay, we're trying to save a data in a format that it doesn't have access to really transform. And so what we can do is we can take our flight model and tell it to transform that data. Okay, and the way we do that as we create this thing called format. And then what we want to do is we want to tell it for the metadata. I'm looking at the screen and the keyboard and the microphone, so that's, forgive the typos throughout the video. There's a lot going on when you record something. So we want to do JSON encode, and that will set us to, whenever the value is submitted to the flights model, it's going to take that meta data, or the meta column essentially, and it's going to JSON encode the value from that. So that should get rid of our issue here. And there we go. The issue was solved. And if we jump back over to the code, hit the database, go to flights here, we'll see that, hey, all this data saved just like we wanted it to. Perfect. Now that we have the data saving, we need to do something other than return a blank screen. So your first impression might be to return another view, right? TR view, and maybe we'll say that view should be the flights.index page. And that would work fine. You know, we could return the flights.index page. Let's do that. And then here we go. We've got a lot of records, and every time we submit, we turn the flights index page. However, we're on the add page, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially in terms of like browser navigation. So what we really want to do is return to the actual index page instead of just printing out a view. So what we can do here is, instead of returning a view, we can return a TR redirect. And this will simply send us a redirect to a specific page. So we'll do flight, and then we will do index, and that will return us to the index admin page, okay? So flight index is what we're looking for, not flights, simply flight, and that will get us back where we want to go. So if we, and you'll notice that the add button's gone. There's some bugs here because it kind of knows this is not the actual index page. So if we go back to the index page here, and you'll even notice that it was highlighted down here. So if we get add here, and I'll say more notes, and let's add some meta, name, Kevin, add new. Oh, we don't want that. We want to hit add here. Now we'll see that we've redirected back to the flight index page, and our record has been added. However, there's more going on here than we like to think about. For one, we got redirected and the user was not notified that anything happened. So we need to sort of flash information to the user that something was updated. And we can do that using the TypeRocket flashing system. So I'm going to look back here, and we're going to scroll into this section here. And what we can do on the redirect is we can send it back with a flash, okay? And we're going to say flight created. So we're going to flash a message whenever something's created, and we're going to say, hey, something happened. We're going to go here, hit add new. I'm just going to hit add, and there we go. Flight created. Thanks for letting me know something happened. All right. So we've got a lot of flights in here, and this works just great. I mean, this is exactly what we need. However, we need to create this edit page, right? So let's look at this edit form. So let's go edit here. And we'll see that the form is automatically filled out because we passed the data into the form from this edit section. And just like we were able to get a flight from the create section, this edit section also gets a flight. However, it's not just any flight, it's the flight of the correct ID. And you might be wondering, well, how did TypeRocket automatically know what flight to pull in when I pulled in this flight object? Well, if we look here, TypeRocket passes in some arguments, and we'll see that the argument is of ID 1. And this is just URL encoded information. So don't worry about this. This is essentially saying, hey, this is of index 0. I believe that's kind of what we're looking at here. So we have an array of information of index 0. And essentially the controller is going to look for these arguments, and it's going to map into index 1. The first argument in our controller is going to get this value. Okay, so if I untype hint this and do tr.dump here and do flight, it will just give us the ID of 1 here. So here we go, ID of 1. And so what happens is when we type hint this particular value, it's going to say, hey, this is a model and I have a value. So I'm going to try to find the value of that flight based on my ID. And what that looks like, if we were to write that out in code, it would look something like this. So here we're just going to have the ID. So we would have flight. And we're going to do a new version of that. And then we do find. Find or, let's see, find or die. And then we just pass the ID in here. And so what it's going to do is give us back the model for this. And here's a giant model, right? We have prefers window seat, and we can see the last name and all kinds of information around this. And so what this is doing for us whenever we type hint this field is it's essentially running this code here without us asking it to. It's you know. And so it's just smart. It just keeps you from having to write a lot of code, and that's it. It's just kind of nice like that. And that's how we're getting our data from the edit route here into the form, and then it's knowing which one to pick up. So if we refresh the page here, we have picked this information up, and then when we hit update, like the create page, we inspect the page here, go to network, refresh, we'll see that a post request is sent. But if we look down here, we'll see that our spoof is a put request, so we know it's going to go to the update method, and then all of our data is very similar to the create request. So in the code, in this update section, all we really need to do is make sure that, again, index 0 from that URL means the first one's going to be the value of the ID, and so we can cast that first one. So anything subsequent to that will just be the default. So we can do that request again, like we did for create to get the fields. And if we were to reverse this, just to make a point here, this flights is not going to be ID 1. Again, request is going to be 1, and so therefore it won't populate flight for us. It will just be a blank object that doesn't query anything. And that's why it needs to be in the same index, this casting needs to be in the same index that is declared in the URL at the top of the page here, that index of 0. I know it looks weird with the URL encoding, but that's what that is. So we're going to get the request and the flight, and we can essentially do the exact same thing we did here. We can just save and redirect back to the index page if we like. I'm going to paste this. So we're going to save that data. We're going to say flight updated. And then instead of redirecting to the index page, let's go just right back to the edit page. And then we need to make sure that we pass that ID right on back to the page. So we need the page and then the ID. So we'll do flight get the ID. I believe that's correct. So notes, edited, update, and there we go. We're redirected back to with the ID of 4 there. And that's how we would go to the page with a particular ID. And there you have it. We have the create, edit, and update, and add pages, and methods. And now we're ready to move on to deleting information. And while we're looking at deleting, we'll also take a look at policies, which will help us protect our database and our UI from people who are logged in who shouldn't be able to access what we have going on.